No one knew why the sky turned gray that morning. It wasn't the clouds or a coming storm. The air just felt wrong. In the small town of Fairhaven, nestled between quiet hills and forgotten highways, life had always moved slowly. But on this day, the silence felt heavier. Unnatural. Like the earth itself was holding its breath. Julie Carter noticed it first. She was sweeping the porch of her bookstore, turned the page, when the birds stopped singing. The usual chatter of morning traffic faded. She paused, broom in hand, her eyes scanning the street. Something was off. Across town, Officer Mark Ramirez sat in his patrol car, sipping coffee and listening to an old rock station. His shift had been quiet until a call came through, something about a man stumbling through traffic near the main square. Ramirez didn't think much of it. Fairhaven had its share of oddballs. But when he arrived, what he saw didn't match any call he'd answered before. A man in torn clothing stood in the middle of the road, his face pale, jaw slack. His eyes were glassy and lifeless. A woman had stopped her car, rolled down the window, and was asking if he was okay. Before Ramirez could react, the man lunged at her window, snarling, clawing, and smashing his face into the glass like a wild animal. Ramirez jumped out, drawing his weapon. "Hey!" he shouted. "Back away!" The man didn't flinch. He smashed the window and dragged the woman halfway out of the car. Her screams echoed through the empty streets. Ramirez fired once, center mass. The man didn't drop. He just turned and stared. Julie heard the siren a moment later. She stepped off her porch and saw smoke rising in the distance. Something twisted in her gut. She closed her shop early and headed toward the community center, where her younger brother worked. Elsewhere, in a local auto shop, ex-Marine Thomas Griggs was under a car when the lights went out. He assumed the power was out again, but when he walked outside, he saw people running, screaming. "Is it a fire?" he asked the neighbor. The man shook his head, eyes wide. "People are attacking each other. Biting. Like animals." Thomas didn't waste time. He rushed inside, grabbed a steel pipe, and headed toward the chaos. Old instincts kicked in. By sundown, the truth was impossible to deny. Fairhaven was no longer safe. The infected were everywhere. People who had once smiled at each other in passing now stalked the streets with torn faces and twisted limbs. The virus, or whatever it was, spread faster than anyone imagined. The town council tried to organize shelters. Julie, Thomas, and Officer Ramirez all found themselves at the local high school, where survivors gathered behind locked doors and barricaded windows. That night, as they huddled together, a frightened teenager asked, "Is this the end of the world?" Thomas shook his head. "Not yet." Julie whispered, "Then what is it?" "It's the beginning," Ramirez said, loading his last clip. "The beginning of something terrible." Outside, the streets moaned with the undead. But inside, something else was beginning to form. A group of ordinary people, brought together by terror and survival, realized they couldn't just hide forever. They would have to fight. Protect each other. Resist the fear. No one would have guessed it then, but these same people, Julie, Thomas, Ramirez, and a few more, would one day become known not just as survivors, but as the Guardians. And this was only the first night. The survivors spent the next few hours and days, trying to make sense of the chaos around them. At first, they thought it was some sort of isolated incident, maybe an outbreak, maybe something they could contain. But as the hours wore on, the truth became undeniable. This was no simple attack. This was the beginning of an apocalypse. The high school gymnasium, once filled with the sounds of teenagers cheering for school events, was now a grim fortress. Barricades were hastily thrown together with desks, lockers, and anything that could be moved. The survivors watched the night fall, the shadows of the undead creeping ever closer to the walls. Julie sat with her back against the cold gym wall, her mind racing. The smell of fear, sweat, and desperation hung in the air. She was used to being in control, to running her bookstore and keeping a low profile, but now she felt utterly powerless. What could she do in the face of this? Beside her, Mark Ramirez was taking charge of the situation. The officer had quickly assumed the role of protector, delegating tasks to the others. Some were sent to help reinforce the barricades, others to find food, and a few to scout the perimeter. But there was one thing Ramirez knew for certain: this would not be over quickly. They couldn't just hide and hope the storm would pass. The undead would keep coming, and if they didn't fight back, they wouldn't survive. "Where's Thomas?" Julie asked quietly. "He's leading a search team," Ramirez replied, his voice low but steady. "We need supplies. And we need to figure out if there's anyone else out there." Julie nodded, though doubt churned in her stomach. Would they really find anyone? Most of Fairhaven's population had been decimated within the first few hours. It was a miracle they'd managed to get so many people together in one place. Thomas Griggs, the ex-Marine, was already proving to be a key figure in their fight for survival. His military training and combat experience were invaluable. It was no surprise that, once the chaos started, he had instinctively assumed the role of strategist, helping Ramirez organize their defenses. When Thomas returned, a grim look on his face, everyone grew quiet. His team had found only more bodies, more of the undead. There was no sign of other survivors. His voice was firm but strained. "We need to get out of here before they surround us completely. We're sitting ducks in this gym." Ramirez turned to him. "I agree, but where do we go? We can't just run into the streets. The whole town is infected." Thomas clenched his fists, his mind already working. "There's a community center 2 blocks away. It's got a basement. If we can make it there, we'll have better odds." Julie, who had been listening carefully, stood up. "If we move in the dark, it's going to be even harder to avoid them. We need a plan, a distraction." Mark nodded. "We'll need someone to lure the zombies away from the path while others move toward the community center." There was a long silence. The others had started to gather in small groups, discussing plans of action. But no one spoke up immediately. The idea of putting themselves in the open, luring the undead toward them, was terrifying. Finally, it was Julie who spoke. "I'll do it." Mark looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "You sure? It's a dangerous move. One wrong step." "I know the streets," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. "I've been through them 1,000 times. I know the back alleys, the shortcuts. I'll make sure the zombies follow me." It was a risky move, one that could end in disaster. But they were running out of time. The longer they stayed in one place, the more they risked being overrun. And so, with nothing left to lose, they agreed. Julie stood, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always been the quiet observer, the one who never made waves. But now, in this new world, she realized she couldn't afford to be passive. She had to be something else. Someone else. The Guardians were born of desperation, yes. But they were also born of the realization that in a world of death, even the most ordinary people could rise to the occasion. And so, as the last light of day faded, Julie stepped into the darkness. The others were counting on her. Julie's heart raced as she stepped out of the gymnasium and into the darkened streets. The night had fallen quickly, the stars barely visible through the heavy clouds. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and every distant sound sent a jolt of fear through her veins. The streets of Fairhaven, once so familiar, now felt like a maze of danger. She kept her breath steady, her mind focused. She couldn't afford to panic. If she did, the zombies would catch her, she had no doubt about that. The first step was to move fast but quietly. She knew the zombies were attracted to sound, so she avoided any unnecessary noise. Her eyes darted between the alleys and the streets, calculating each movement, making sure no one was too close. The first group of undead she saw was a small cluster near a convenience store. They were huddled in the doorway, drawn by the smell of something, perhaps the remnants of food or a spilled drink. Julie froze, her back pressed against the brick wall of the alley. She watched as the creatures, once people, moved sluggishly, their arms outstretched, mouths agape. They hadn't seen her yet. She took a deep breath and turned, sprinting in the opposite direction. Her footsteps were quick but light, barely audible over the distant moans of the undead. The next block was clear, but she could hear more of them in the distance, getting closer with every passing second. Julie knew she couldn't make it all the way to the community center without drawing attention. She needed to lure them away from the path, into a place where she could lose them. Her eyes caught sight of an old fire truck parked near the edge of town, its engine long dead, but the siren still hanging loosely from the front. A perfect distraction. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for a nearby rock and threw it against the truck. The sound of the impact reverberated down the street, and within moments, she could hear the shuffle of feet. The undead were moving toward the noise. Julie took off, keeping her pace steady but not too fast. She needed them to follow her, not to lose interest. She darted down a narrow street, weaving between abandoned cars and old storefronts, her mind calculating the best route. She had to make it to the community center, but she also needed to make sure the others were safe before they moved out. As she turned the corner, she saw them. A horde of zombies, maybe 20 or more, stumbling in her direction. Their eyes locked onto her, and their moans grew louder, more frantic. Julie didn't hesitate. She turned and ran, her pulse pounding in her ears. They were close now, too close. The undead shuffled faster, their broken limbs dragging them across the pavement. Her legs burned, but she pushed through the pain. She could hear the group behind her growing louder, their feet slapping against the ground as they chased her down. Julie risked a glance over her shoulder, seeing the horrifying image of the dead crowding the street. She was the bait. And they were hungry. The alley ahead was narrow, and the space between the buildings was tight. It would be hard for the zombies to follow her all the way through. She dove into the space, narrowly avoiding an outstretched hand. Her breath caught in her throat, but she couldn't afford to slow down. Julie's mind raced as she neared a small, abandoned shop. There, hidden in the shadows, was a dumpster, a perfect place to hide for a moment, to let the zombies pass. She dove behind it, her back scraping against the rough concrete. For a moment, everything went quiet. The only sound was her own heavy breathing. She waited, eyes peeking out from behind the dumpster. The zombies were just a few yards away now. She held her breath, praying they wouldn't find her. But luck wasn't on her side. One of them turned, its vacant eyes locking onto her hiding spot. Its jaw dropped open, emitting a low growl. The rest of the horde followed, their dead eyes drawn to her like moths to a flame. Julie's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't wait to be caught. She bolted again, pushing herself harder than ever before. The zombies followed, closing the gap with every step. She had to make it to the community center. She couldn't stop now. Julie's breath was ragged as she sprinted through the darkened streets. The horde of zombies was hot on her heels, their dragging footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent town. The sound was deafening, a constant reminder that every step she took could be her last. But she couldn't stop, not when the community center was so close. Her legs screamed in protest, but Julie pushed them harder, her mind fixed on the faint outline of the building just a few blocks away. She could make it. She had to. As she rounded a corner, her foot caught on a piece of debris, a broken piece of wood, and she stumbled. Panic surged in her chest as she went down hard on her knees, scraping them raw against the pavement. She gasped, the wind knocked out of her for a moment, but there was no time to rest. The zombies were getting closer. She could hear their growls, their insistent shuffling. They were almost there. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the sting in her palms as she pushed herself up. Her body felt heavy, sluggish, but she forced herself to run again, faster this time. But then, just as she thought she might make it, she heard a familiar voice, gravelly but strong. "Julie! Over here!" She looked to her left. Ramirez was standing in the shadow of a building, waving his arm frantically. His face was covered in grime, but his eyes were sharp, filled with determination. He had come for her. She ran toward him, but as she did, she caught sight of something else, a figure emerging from the darkness. It was Thomas, holding a flashlight and motioning for her to hurry. But it wasn't just Thomas. Behind him, the unmistakable silhouette of a zombie loomed. Julie's heart stopped for a moment, and she froze. The zombie was barely a few feet behind Thomas. She screamed, warning him, but the words came out as a strangled gasp. Before Thomas could turn around, the zombie lunged. Without thinking, Julie reacted. She grabbed a nearby metal pipe and swung it with all her strength, catching the undead creature across the side of its head. The force sent it sprawling to the ground with a sickening crack. Thomas spun around, eyes wide. "Julie! What are you doing here?" She started, panting. "I was luring them away." But before she could finish, more zombies emerged from the darkness. Dozens of them, drawn to the sound of the struggle. The horde was closing in on them. "We need to go. Now!" Ramirez shouted. Without waiting for an answer, he grabbed Julie's arm and pulled her forward. Thomas followed closely behind, leading them through the back alleys toward the community center. The zombies were just a few steps behind, their growls growing louder. The community center was in sight now, a pale light glowing from the windows. It was their last hope, the only place left that might provide them with shelter. They just had to make it inside before the undead overwhelmed them. They reached the entrance, and without hesitation, Ramirez shoved the door open. The group rushed inside, barely squeezing through before the zombies could get any closer. The door slammed shut with a heavy thud, and they quickly pushed a large metal chair against it, barricading themselves inside. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their ragged breathing and the distant growls of the undead pressing against the door. Thomas dropped to his knees, exhausted but alive. Julie stood at the door, her hand resting on the cold metal, as though she were listening for any sounds of pursuit. They were safe, for now. "We're in," Ramirez said, his voice hoarse. "But we're not out of the woods yet." Julie nodded, glancing around the dimly lit room. It was empty except for a few tables and chairs, a place that had once been used for town meetings and events. Now, it would serve as their temporary sanctuary. But how long could they stay here? The world outside was changing, and the undead were growing more numerous by the minute. "What's the plan now?" Thomas asked, his voice low but urgent. "We regroup, find supplies, and prepare to fight back," Ramirez answered. "But we need to do it fast. We don't know how long this place will hold." Julie looked at the faces of the two men, her unexpected companions in this nightmare. They weren't heroes. They weren't soldiers. But they were all that was left. And for the first time since everything went to hell, Julie felt something other than fear. A spark of hope. They might be just a few survivors in a world of the undead, but together, they would fight. They had no choice. And they would fight for each other. The silence in the community center was suffocating. Julie, Ramirez, and Thomas huddled together near the window, peering out into the dark streets. The glow from the dying streetlights outside cast long shadows, and the distant growls of the undead were a constant reminder of the nightmare that had taken over their world. "How long can we stay here?" Julie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not long," Ramirez replied, his eyes scanning the streets. "The horde is growing. We need to think about our next move." Julie nodded, her mind racing. They couldn't stay here forever, not with the zombies so close. But what other choice did they have? The world outside was a death trap. There were no safe havens, no escape. Thomas clenched his jaw, a grim look on his face. "We need to make a stand. If we don't fight back, we're just waiting to die." Ramirez turned to him, his brow furrowed. "You're right. But we can't just rush out there without a plan. We need supplies. And we need to reinforce this place." Julie hesitated before speaking, her gaze focused on the street outside. "I can go out and scout. I know this area. I can get us what we need." "No," Thomas said firmly. "It's too dangerous. We're not sending anyone out alone. Julie met his gaze. She wasn't afraid to take risks, not anymore. I'm not asking to go alone. But I can help. I know where the supply stores are. If we want to survive, we need food, medicine, and weapons. I can get in and out faster than you two. Ramirez and Thomas exchanged a long look. Neither of them wanted to risk losing another member of their group, but Julie was right, they needed supplies, and they needed them now. All right, Ramirez finally said, his tone resolute. But you're not doing this alone. We'll go with you. We stick together. Julie nodded. Then let's do it. The plan was simple, but dangerous. They would leave the community center at dawn, when the undead were less active, and make their way to the local pharmacy, which was just a few blocks away. From there, they would head to a nearby grocery store and then to a hardware shop for weapons. They moved quickly, navigating the back streets to avoid being spotted. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale orange light over the town. It was eerily quiet, the streets still and deserted. Julie led the way, her senses on high alert. She was used to moving quickly, but now, every shadow felt like a potential threat. As they neared the pharmacy, Julie's heart skipped a beat. There was movement up ahead. A small group of zombies was slowly making its way down the street, their groans drifting toward them. Get down! Thomas hissed, grabbing Julie and pulling her into the shadow of a nearby alley. They crouched low, holding their breath as the zombies shuffled past. Julie's heart was pounding in her chest, her mind racing. The undead were everywhere. One wrong move, and they'd be surrounded. The group waited until the zombies passed, then continued on their way. Julie led them to the pharmacy, her eyes scanning the area for any more threats. They made it to the door without incident, and Ramirez pushed it open, the sound of the creaking hinges sending a chill down Julie's spine. Inside, the shelves were mostly empty, but there were a few items left, bandages, painkillers, and some basic medical supplies. Julie quickly grabbed what they needed and handed them to Ramirez. Let's go, she whispered, her voice tight with urgency. They moved quickly, but as they exited the pharmacy, disaster struck. A loud crash echoed through the street, and Julie's stomach sank as she turned to see a horde of zombies emerging from the alley behind them. There were too many to fight. Run! Ramirez shouted. They didn't hesitate. Julie led the way as they sprinted toward the grocery store. The sound of the undead behind them was deafening, but they couldn't stop, not yet. They had to reach the safety of the store and get inside before they were caught. They were almost there when Julie's foot caught on a loose piece of debris, sending her tumbling to the ground. She gasped as her hands scraped against the rough asphalt. Panic surged through her, but before she could scramble to her feet, a cold hand grabbed her arm. Thomas was there in an instant, pulling her up and pushing her forward. Keep moving! Julie didn't look back. They were close now, just a few yards from the door of the store. But the zombies were closing in fast. She could feel their breath on the back of her neck. With one final burst of speed, they reached the door. Ramirez shoved it open, and they all piled inside, slamming it shut behind them just as the first zombie reached the entrance. Breathing heavily, they backed away from the door, their hearts still racing. They were safe, at least for now. Julie took a moment to steady herself, her hands shaking as she wiped the sweat from her brow. They had made it. They had survived another fight. But she knew the worst was yet to come. Outside, the horde was still coming. And they had no idea how much longer they could keep running. Inside the grocery store, the group quickly made their way through the aisles, grabbing anything that could be useful, canned food, water bottles, a few bags of chips, and whatever else they could find. Julie barely noticed what she was grabbing, her mind focused on the noise outside. The zombies were still coming. She turned to Ramirez, who was already scouting the store for anything more useful. We need a plan, she said, her voice tight with urgency. We can't keep running forever. Ramirez nodded, looking around the store. We'll barricade the windows and doors. We can hold out here for a while. At least long enough to rest and figure out our next move. Julie glanced over at Thomas, who was standing near the back of the store, keeping an eye on the zombies outside through the small windows. He was silent, his face set in a grim expression. "We can't just wait around," he said, his voice hoarse. "The horde will only get bigger. We need to push back, take out as many of them as we can." Julie knew he was right, but there was something in his voice, something desperate, that made her hesitate. "We don't have the resources for a fight," she said. "We can't go up against hundreds of them. Not without a plan." "We'll make a plan," Ramirez said, his voice firm. "But first, we get to safety. We need to hold them off just long enough for us to regroup." Julie nodded, her mind racing. She could hear the zombies growing closer, their guttural moans filling the air. The store was their only refuge for now, but how long would it last? They moved quickly, blocking the windows with empty boxes and shelves, anything they could find. The store's metal door was already barricaded, but they made sure it was secure, piling cans and boxes up against it as well. "We're as ready as we can be," Ramirez said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. Julie took a moment to breathe, her back against a shelf. "We've been running for so long, when does it end?" "We don't know," Thomas replied, his voice low. "But we keep fighting. We keep surviving. That's the only thing that matters now." The words felt hollow, but Julie understood. There was no hope for the world they once knew. The only thing left was survival. And if they didn't fight back, they wouldn't have a chance. They gathered around a small table at the back of the store, mapping out a strategy. The zombies outside were starting to surround the store, but they weren't moving in, yet. Julie's thoughts raced as she considered their options. They needed weapons, supplies, and a way to escape, but the closest exit was overrun with zombies. "We'll need to make a break for it," Ramirez said, his voice calm but determined. "We'll fight our way through if we have to." Julie nodded, her mind focused on the plan. They would need to create a diversion, draw the zombies away from the exit, and then make a run for it. But there was one problem: they didn't have enough ammunition or weapons to take down an entire horde. And with every passing minute, more undead were closing in. "We need to create an opening," Julie said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "If we can distract them, we can make a break for the back alley." Thomas shook his head. "It won't be enough. We'll be trapped in there." "I have an idea," Ramirez said, his eyes narrowing as he considered their surroundings. "There's a fire escape at the back of the building. If we can get to it, we can reach the roof and find a way out." Julie's heart skipped a beat. "The roof? We get up there, we'll have a better vantage point," Ramirez explained. "And we can figure out how to get out of the area." It was a risky move, but Julie couldn't think of a better option. "We do it," she said firmly. "We move when the zombies are distracted, and we head straight for the back." No hesitation. The three of them prepared in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Julie's hands trembled as she tightened the grip on her crowbar, the only weapon she had. But it would have to do. The zombies were getting closer, their groans more frantic now. Julie could hear the faint scratching of their claws against the metal door, and she knew they didn't have much time. "We're ready," Ramirez said, his voice tight with anticipation. Julie nodded. "Let's do it." They moved quickly, crouching low and sticking to the shadows. Ramirez led the way, and Thomas followed closely behind, with Julie taking the rear. They moved toward the back of the store, the sound of the zombies outside growing louder. Julie's heart was in her throat as they neared the door that led to the fire escape. Ramirez reached for the handle, his fingers brushing the cold metal. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a quick motion, he swung the door open. The horde outside heard it immediately. The first zombie stumbled forward, then the others followed. The sound of their growls filled the air as Julie and her group sprinted toward the fire escape. It was now or never. The metal fire escape rattled beneath their feet as Julie, Ramirez, and Thomas scrambled up the narrow staircase. Their breaths were ragged, and the sound of zombies pounding against the walls below them was a constant reminder of how close they were to being overrun. Every second counted. Julie glanced up toward the roof. It seemed so far away, yet it was their only chance. If they could get to the top, they could assess their surroundings and possibly find a way out of the town. But getting there was proving to be more difficult than she'd imagined. Faster! Ramirez hissed, urging them forward. Julie's legs were burning, but she pushed herself harder, gripping the rusty railings and pulling herself up with everything she had. Thomas was right behind her, his face pale but determined. He'd never been a fighter, but the fear in his eyes had long since been replaced with resolve. They reached the rooftop, breathless but alive. Julie quickly turned, checking to make sure the others were with her. Ramirez and Thomas were right behind her, and for the moment, they were safe. At least for now. The rooftop stretched out in front of them, offering a wide view of the street below. The town was a shadow of its former self, destroyed, abandoned, and filled with the remnants of chaos. Zombies roamed the streets aimlessly, while others were congregated around the entrances to buildings, their groans echoing through the empty town. "There has to be a way out of here," Julie muttered, scanning the rooftops ahead. "Maybe we can get to that other building. We can climb down and make it through the back alleys." Ramirez shook his head. "That's too risky. We're exposed up here. If we make a move, we'll draw attention. We need to stay low for now." Julie's heart sank. They were running out of options. She felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her, but she refused to give in to despair. They couldn't let it end like this. "We have to do something," she said, turning toward Thomas, who had been quiet for too long. "What do you think?" Thomas looked out across the desolate streets, his eyes narrowing as if he were calculating something. After a long pause, he spoke. "We don't have the luxury of time," he said quietly. "There's no getting out of this town undetected. We need to make a stand here." Ramirez was about to protest, but Julie stopped him with a raised hand. "What are you thinking, Thomas?" Thomas took a deep breath, his eyes focused on the zombies below. "We set a trap. We use what we've got, whatever we can find on this rooftop. Make them come to us. We'll fight back, make sure they don't swarm us." Julie's eyes widened. It was risky, but it was their only shot at survival. "We'll need weapons." "Look around," Thomas said. "There's stuff here we can use, metal poles, bricks, anything that'll work." Julie nodded, already scanning the roof for anything that could be useful. She grabbed a rusted pipe and handed it to Ramirez, then picked up a few bricks and tossed them to Thomas. They quickly went to work, preparing their makeshift defenses. Julie's heart was pounding in her chest as she felt the weight of the situation closing in. The zombies were still below them, some of them beginning to look up toward the roof, sensing their presence. "We'll set up here," Ramirez said, pointing to a section of the roof where a broken-down wall provided some cover. "If we stay here, we can pick them off one by one as they approach." Julie looked over at him, her mind racing. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the best they had. They needed to buy themselves enough time to think of another way out. "Stay sharp," she said, gripping her crowbar tightly. "We fight until we can't fight anymore." They waited, the tension rising with every passing second. The sounds of the undead below grew louder, and Julie's pulse quickened as she saw them start to gather around the base of the building. "I think they're starting to realize we're up here," Ramirez said quietly. "They're getting organized." Julie's stomach churned. It was only a matter of time before the horde would charge. They wouldn't be able to hold them off forever. But they had to try. If they didn't fight now, they would be overrun. And there would be no escape. A few moments later, the first zombies began to climb the fire escape, their clawed hands scraping against the metal as they ascended. Julie gripped her crowbar tighter, ready for what was to come. "Get ready!" Ramirez shouted. Julie's heart was in her throat as she swung her crowbar at the first zombie to reach the rooftop. The blow connected with a sickening thud, sending the undead creature tumbling back down the fire escape. But it wasn't enough. More were coming. She stepped back as Ramirez swung his pipe, taking out another zombie. The three of them fought back to back, each blow more desperate than the last. The zombies kept coming, their numbers growing by the minute. Julie's body ached from the effort, but she refused to give up. She fought with everything she had, her arms burning with exhaustion. And then, just when it seemed like they couldn't hold out any longer, Ramirez yelled, "We've got a break in the horde. Move!" Without hesitation, they turned and ran for the far side of the roof, hoping to make it to the edge where they could descend into the back alley. But the zombies were relentless. As they reached the edge, Julie glanced over her shoulder and saw the worst sight yet. The entire horde had gathered below, and they were closing in. "Let me know when you're ready for part 8. Julie's heart pounded in her chest as she looked down at the horde below. The zombies were swarming toward the base of the building, and they were coming faster than she could have ever imagined. Her stomach dropped as the realization hit her, they had no way out. "Move!" Ramirez shouted, pulling her toward the corner of the rooftop. But Julie didn't move. She was frozen, staring at the sea of undead below, feeling the weight of it all pressing in on her. This was it. This was the end. "No!" Thomas's voice broke through her thoughts. "We can still make it. We can still fight." Julie's eyes darted to him. His face was covered in sweat, his expression wild with fear, but there was something else there too, determination. They couldn't give up now. "Thomas is right," Ramirez said, grabbing Julie's arm and pulling her towards the far side of the roof. "We can't just give up. We're not done yet." Julie didn't have time to argue. The zombies were getting closer, and if they didn't make a move, they would be surrounded. She forced herself to run, her legs heavy, her breath ragged. They were heading for the fire escape again, the last option they had. But as they reached the edge of the roof, something caught Julie's eye. The other building across the street. There, a large billboard had fallen and created a narrow, shaky bridge between the two rooftops. It wasn't much, certainly not stable enough to walk on without risking a fall, but it was their only chance. "Over there!" Julie shouted, pointing toward the bridge. Thomas and Ramirez turned, their eyes following her gaze. "Are you crazy?" Ramirez said, his voice incredulous. "That thing will never hold." Julie's pulse raced, but she couldn't back down now. "It's our only chance. We have to try." There was no time for hesitation. The horde was closing in, and Julie knew if they didn't act now, they would be trapped. She turned and ran toward the edge, ignoring the fear that surged through her veins. She leaped onto the broken bridge without thinking, her hands gripping the side for balance. The bridge creaked under her weight, but it held, at least for now. She could feel the sharp wind against her face as she crossed, each step uncertain, each movement slow and calculated. The sound of the zombies behind her grew louder, closer. There was no turning back. Thomas and Ramirez followed quickly behind her, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. Julie's heart pounded as she made her way across, praying that the bridge would hold. The sound of the undead grew louder and more frantic, but she kept her focus on the other side. Finally, with one last burst of energy, she reached the far building, pulling herself up onto the roof. She gasped for breath, her muscles screaming in protest. But she was alive. They were alive. "Come on!" Julie yelled to Thomas and Ramirez, who were just behind her. They made it across, one by one, and the three of them collapsed on the rooftop, panting and exhausted. They had made it, barely. For a long moment, none of them spoke. They just lay there, looking at the sprawling, empty city below them. The world they had known was gone, replaced by chaos, destruction, and fear. But in that moment, as the sun began to set in the distance, something shifted. They had survived. And that, for now, was enough. But Julie knew this wasn't the end. They had escaped this fight, but there were more battles to come. The world was still crawling with the undead, and survival wasn't guaranteed. They had to keep moving, keep fighting, and keep hoping that, one day, they would find the way to end it all. As the light faded, Julie turned to Ramirez and Thomas, both of them weary but still strong. She could see it in their eyes, they had become something more. They were survivors. They were guardians. And they would keep fighting until the world was free. With a deep breath, Julie stood up, looking out toward the horizon. "The fight's not over," she said quietly. "Not yet." And with that, they began their journey once more, toward whatever lay ahead, ready to face whatever the world had left to throw at them. This concludes Rise of the Guardians, How Everyday People Became Legends in a World of the Undead, Zombies audiobooks. Let me know if you need anything else.